South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol wrapped up his three-country overseas tour that began with Queen Elizabeth II's funeral and was followed by a speech at the UN General Assembly and a trip to Canada. For a look back on his second overseas trip as South Korea president and what we can expect going forward, we have SONG Se-ryun, professor of law at Kyung University, and Taehyun, professor of political science at Salisbury University, with us this morning. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Well, I want to start with you, Professor Song. President Yoon's three-nation tour of the UK, US, and Canada was jam-packed, but wasn't without hiccups. Focusing on the key points of his overseas trip, let's begin with Yoon's first UN General Assembly speech. Yoon seemed to emphasize the solidarity of UN nations and South Korea's role. What did you make of his speech and his vision for Korea?
Well, it sounded like a familiar speech. The word liberty was mentioned in 21 times, solidarity 8 times. It sounded a lot like his inauguration speech and also independence speech, in which he had repeatedly invoked the liberty concept. I thought it was a fine speech, although it was spoken in generalities, so it's hard to delineate any specific policy positions. One thing is pretty clear, that in today's new Cold War era, Korea is pretty clear which side it is on. I think it raises the immediate question whether, given our geopolitical situation, and all the issues are thought through, especially with a relationship with China and also Russia as well. So issues like energy, trade, and North Korea are not easily extrapolated from this speech or other speeches. So in that sense, it was a diplomatic trip, which with a little bit of a hiccup, but I don't think we could have expected much more accomplishments than the meet and greet and the tour of the cities and meeting people.
Right, and now turning to you, Professor Nam, as Professor Song said, it didn't have specific words for some of the instances, but North Korea, although not mentioned by name, was certainly described by the mentions of hostile situations that Pyongyang brings to the world. In fact, just yesterday we saw North launching a missile protesting the arrival of a U.S. aircraft carrier to the peninsula. How do you think the world will rally behind President Yoon to deal with the North?
Will the world rally behind Yoon? I'm not so sure. The question itself and such expectation, I think, has some problems. 2 problems, I should say. First one, it assumes that the entire world confront, North Korea, a country. I don't think that's the case. If they really behind and sort of rally behind and rally against North Korea, it will be, of course, the U.S. allies and United States, including, of course, South Korea. I know it may sound like a mundane, but we cannot really forget that often most countries in Africa, Latin America, China, Russia, and its allies will care not a whole lot about the situation and development. And also, they may not really support United States and South Korea and its allies. Second, when the U.S. allies actually confront the North Korea, they will not, I think, really rally behind the South Korea, but behind the United States. Because, United States will play a big role. In other words, as the tension in peninsula rises, South Korea will have a less and less voice. We already experienced this situation back in 2018 when Kim and Trump were busy exchanging threats to each other, right? South Korea, if you recall, at the time, looked like a child sitting at a dinner table while 2 parents are sort of in a shouting match, right? South Korea became relevant and more important only when the tension went down. Again, if you remember, when Moon Jae-in and his administration actively sought compromise only then South Korea was able to mobilize world support. So as the tension intensifies even further, probably than now, right? The Yoon administration will depend more and more on the U.S. support, which means his administration and South Korea in general, unfortunately, will have a less and less influence on South Korea's own national security matters.
And speaking of the U.S., President Yoon met with President Joe Biden, albeit short, on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. Among the range of priority issues between the two countries, Professor Song, what do you think was highlighted?
Well, I don't know if we can talk about any highlights at that point. It was less than a minute meeting. So I think there was clearly an expectation or high hope that there would be a full-blown summit meeting, and we can raise concerns about the IRA and the EV industry in Korea. But because of the changes in Joe Biden's itinerary, that didn't take place. However, it doesn't mean that the talks are not going on or the efforts were made. That's why the Minister Lee is taking a U.S. trip. But I think that the IRA issue was a pretty uphill battle, I think, because the legislation itself is the Democratic Party's best hope before the November midterm election. So it was, to begin with, very hard to change the tone or say something very different from the legislation. But I think that there are rooms for political solutions. So efforts will go on. But in terms of what happened between the Joe Biden and President Yoon in that short meeting, probably it was significant in that they met again and exchanged greetings in the series of meetings that they have been having over the years.
Right, a lot to solve, but nothing will be solved within a meeting between the two in that short period of time. Now, we saw South Korean president be in Canada for an actual summit following the UN Assembly. Now, Professor Nam, what do you see in the future of South Korea and Canada working together?
The two countries share same political agenda, similar political agenda, similar political ideology. So in terms of politics and foreign affairs, I think the two countries have a lot more potential to explore, to form some stronger diplomatic tie, even develop some sort of regular channel discussing security issues. And also, I think Canada and United States is, of course, a good partner, both United States and South Korea. So from Yoon Suk-yeol's administration's perspective, Canada can also be on sort of a route to U.S. market. And also, let's not forget that Canada really is rich with a lot of natural resources, right? So from that regard, South Korea need Canada's partnership, I think, for economic development. Also, let's not forget that Canada could be really, really important when the Arctic Sea lane opens up more to the transportation. And of course, I'm talking about, unfortunately, the global warming and melting ice in the Arctic area, but which is coming. But when that happens, and when then there are some more spaces and route, South Korea could benefit a lot by using that sort of a new route to Europe, which will save a lot of cost for South Korean economy. And I'm pretty sure they will have a really significant bearing on South Korea's national security issue as well.
Right, and also another meeting with another country's leader was with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. For months, Seoul and Tokyo have expressed their desire to improve ties. Professor Song, now, What is the current status of such efforts? How significant was the leaders' meeting?
Well, I don't know how significant the content of the meeting was, but I think it was significant by the fact that they met at all. I think it could be a starting of a mending process for some of the tensions that the two countries had. Diplomacy is a cumulative and very slow process, so let's see what they can build from a brief meeting. I think the significance, if I say a little bit more, is that opened the door for working level discussions, and the reports say that they did raise some issues without agreeing anything, issues like the compensation for the victims of forced labor, and also North Korea issues, economic issues as well. So those are the things that we could say are put on the table per se, so that there would be some more talks going forward, especially with the working level.
Right, and Professor Song, adding to that, historical matters related to Japan's wartime recruitment of forced labor and sexual enslavement of women, as well as a territorial dispute, are all issues the two sides have clashed over throughout the decades. Now, and you've been in the industry for a long time. How do you see President Yoon's approach to resolving this as opposed to the former administrations?
I think that President Yoon almost can build upon what has gone through it before. I think the previous administration had the stance that the historical issues is a significant issue, and even the judiciary in Korea is making determination on the side of the victims. Without subtracting anything from that, the Yoon administration can now say that, well, our approach is that we can be more practical building from that and compartmentalize those historical issues with the current economic and security issues. So we can walk and chew the gum at the same time so that we can go through or go ahead with the talks on more practical issues on the securities and economy and other issues, regardless of how we deal with separately on the historical issues.
Right, and Professor Nam, I wanted to bring to your attention as well, because it has to be in the U.S. interest for South Korea and Japan to sort things out. How do you see President Biden maybe coming into action to make sure the two countries are in better terms?
Well, the U.S. administration, whether or not it's a Biden administration or previous administration, for that matter, put out a lot of pressure on the South Korean government all along, right, to sort of fix this problem of history. But of course, it is, as we know, it is really, really difficult because it is deeply sort of linked to the national identity and the public's sentiment. And so it is, of course, important foreign affairs issue. It is important domestic. It is also a very domestic issue, and more importantly, it's a really political issue. So Yoon administration really have to address this issue in order to make this so-called triangular sort of alliance in East Asia, if that is the route that Yoon administration wanted to go. So the domestic politics, getting more sort of hearing more voice from the victims, and hearing from more the various voices within the South Korean society, I think it is the first sort of step that Yoon administration must take in order to sort of improve this diplomatic sort of quagmire in East Asia, I think.
Right, and I'm afraid that's all the questions I have for today due to the time. We touched upon a lot of different issues, but thank you so much for joining us and being able to provide us with the deep insight on a wide range of topics. Well, that was SONG Se-ryun, Professor of Law at Kyung University, and Taehyun, Professor of Political Science at Salisbury University. Thank you again, and hope to speak to you both again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.